Did you know you have a testimony of what God did for you before you were born? That's what Jeremiah says. He says, before I formed you in the womb, God said, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart and appointed you to a specific task. We've already seen how your first part of your testimony is that before you were born, God knew you. He knew all about you, knew your name, knew where you lived, knew everything about you. You didn't exist before you were born, except in the mind of God. He knew you and called you by name. Secondly, He set you apart from everyone else on this planet and considers you as holy unto Himself, because there's something for you can do, no one can do like you can do. And then He says, Jeremiah says, thirdly, God said, I appointed you to a task. In Jeremiah's case, I appointed you to be a prophet to the nation. In our task, He appoints us to a specific task. This is an awesome thought that before we were born, God had a purpose for our lives. There was something for us to do. He has designed us to do that no one else can do like we can do. Do you know that word assigned, appointed us to a task, is the same word we find in Genesis chapter 1, verse 17, when in the creation it says that God set the stars in their places in the heavens. He appointed them. He set them there. Billions of stars. You know, here in Dallas, we don't see a lot of stars, but we spent the 4th of July weekend some time ago down in the hill country where it was, as James Weldon Johnson would say in God's Trombones, it was blacker than 1,000 midnights down in a cypress swamp. And those billions of stars just burst into that night sky. And we saw the Big Dipper. And across from it, we'd see the North Star. Every night, they were right there in their place, as they've been since the creation of the world. And there they were in their assigned, appointed places. And all those billions of stars, God set them there. He assigned them there, the Bible says. And we can set our watch by them. They run in clock-like precision. And that's exactly the same word God used to describe how He has appointed you, that He has placed you here for a specific purpose, in a specific place, in a specific time. And so how important it is to be about the business of that assignment. You know, we lived in Fort Lauderdale when we sent our daughters to college, and they came to TCU, and 1,500 miles away from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I remember when we brought Holly back to TCU as a freshman, we were moving her in the freshman dorm, and Susie was fixing up the dorm. She assigned me one task. It was a little pedestal table, had one column on it, 4 screws to screw in, just a little end table, that it was my assignment. It irritates me when my wife goes to Home Depot and picks out something that you have to put together and not something that's already there. But she assigned me that task. How hard could it be? I turned the table over, put the pedestal on it. There were those holes already screwed. All I had to do is put those screws in there, those little Phillips screws with the cross. I went over and got a kitchen knife and started turning them down. And after a minute or two, I looked at that knife. The end of it was all bent. One of my knuckles had already gotten bloody. My wife, Susie, walked by and she reached over to her tool chest, pulled out a Phillips screwdriver, tossed it over to me with a few choice words and said, why don't you try this? I put that Phillips screwdriver in that screw. It felt so good. It felt so, and I turned it and it tightened and it screwed that screw in so tight. It felt so good and I felt so good about myself. What was the difference? That screwdriver was doing what God purposed it to do, what some designer had designed it to do. And so it is with us. When we really get about the business of finding God's will for our lives, it feels so right when we're in the middle of the will of God. God did all that before we were born, and there's one other word. He said, I knew you, I set you apart, I appointed you, I formed you in your mother's womb before we were born. God formed us in our mother's womb. What a thought that He framed us in our mother's womb. This brings a whole new light to the abortion issue. Well-meaning Christians have different ideas of when life begins. Some say that life begins when that baby breathes his first breath because they say He breathed into them the breath of life. Other well-meaning believers say no, it's when the baby is viable outside the womb, can live outside the womb. Others say no, life begins when we detect that first heartbeat. Most people say life begins at conception, when that seed of man and egg of woman come together and that baby is conceived in that tiny speck of protoplasm unseen to the naked eye, with all the intricacies of a nervous system, a respiratory system, a circulatory system, and the rest. But you know what? Life doesn't even begin there. Life begins back in the eternal counsels of God, where He formed us in our mother's womb. It began way back there with God. So we have a testimony of what God did for us before we were born. He knew me. He set me apart for a task. He appointed me to a specific purpose. And then He formed me. And incidentally, that's the only verb in Jeremiah 1:5 in the imperfect tense. That means it's continuous action. The others are past completed. He knew me, that's past. He set me aside, He's already done that. He appointed me, He's already done that. He formed me, is continuous action. Like the potter on the wheel, not only did He form me in my mother's womb, He still uses circumstances in my life and yours to form us, to fashion us, to mold us, to make us into His perfect will. He knows you, but that's not the real question. Do you know Him in the free pardoning of sin? You have a testimony of what God did for you before you were born.